You? A date? Claire Whitmore's laugh cut through the glass-walled conference room, sharp and effortless, the kind that didn't ask permission to humiliate. And for a second, 3 others joined her, quick, reflexive, almost grateful it wasn't them being laughed at, while Daniel Brooks stood at the far end of the polished table, one hand resting lightly on a folder, the other still, as if even his fingers had learned the discipline of silence, and he answered simply, yes. Not louder, not firmer, just steady. Like a man stating the weather rather than defending his worth, and the room shifted, not in his favor, but into that familiar current where assumptions harden into judgment, where a worn jacket and a quiet voice get mistaken for a small life, and Claire tilted her head, eyes narrowing just enough to signal amusement rather than curiosity. That's surprising, she said, each syllable dressed in velvet and condescension, and someone near the window muttered, "Didn't know he had time for that," followed by a soft chuckle that never quite became a full laugh, because even mockery has limits when it senses something it can't fully read. And Daniel didn't look at any of them, didn't rush to explain who she was or why she mattered, didn't reach for the easy defense that might have earned him a moment of approval, because men like him learn early that dignity isn't negotiated in rooms like this, it's carried quietly, even when it goes unseen. And the overhead lights hummed faintly, reflecting off the glass, turning every face into a layered reflection of itself. Claire's confidence multiplied, Daniel's restraint almost invisible unless you knew where to look, and for a brief second, the air felt heavier, like the pause before something decides what it wants to become, ridicule or regret, and Claire leaned back in her chair, crossing one leg over the other with practiced ease, the kind of posture that came from years of being the most powerful person in the room. Well, she added lightly, I hope she knows what she's getting into. And this time the laughter didn't follow, not fully, not convincingly, because something in Daniel's stillness refused to cooperate with the script they had already written for him, and he gave a small nod, not in agreement, not in submission, just acknowledgement, as if her words were passing weather again. And he gathered his papers with the same measured care he applied to everything else in his life, the kind of care that comes from raising a child alone, from fixing what breaks without announcing it, from showing up even when no one is watching. And as he turned toward the door, there was no anger in his step, no urgency to escape, only that same quiet rhythm, steady, grounded, unshaken, and behind him the room exhaled, unsure why the moment hadn't landed the way it was supposed to, unsure why the joke felt unfinished, like it had been told too early, before the truth had a chance to arrive. And in that thin, almost invisible space between laughter and silence, something had already begun to change. If you're enjoying this story, take a second to subscribe. It really helps the channel. Now let's go on. By the time the door closed behind Daniel Brooks, the room did not return to normal. It leaned into something quieter, something more deliberate, like a decision had already been made without a vote. And Claire Whitmore tapped her pen once against the table, then twice, a subtle signal that the moment was over. Yet no one moved on as quickly as they should have, because the idea of Daniel having a date had settled into the room like an inconvenient truth that refused to dissolve. I mean, come on, one of the managers finally said, leaning forward with a half-smile that searched for agreement. He barely speaks unless he has to. And another replied, maybe it is one of those online things, you know, low expectations, followed by a quiet laugh that felt safer now that Daniel was gone. And Claire did not laugh this time. She only watched the door for a fraction of a second longer than necessary before shifting her attention back to the documents in front of her. Focus, she said. Calm, controlled, but her tone carried a sharper edge now, not because she was offended, but because something about the moment had not resolved the way she preferred. And control to Claire was everything. The meeting resumed, numbers were discussed, projections were adjusted, voices returned to their professional cadence. Yet under it all, there was a current, subtle but persistent, that kept circling back to the same question no one wanted to ask directly. Who would choose a man like Daniel Brooks, and more importantly, why had he sounded so certain, so unbothered, as if the outcome of their judgment did not apply to him? And across the building, Daniel walked down a quieter hallway where the lights were softer and the hum of conversation faded into distant echoes, his steps unhurried, his expression unchanged as he pulled out his phone and checked the time, not with anxiety, but with quiet awareness, like someone who measures his life in responsibilities rather than impressions. And he paused near a window overlooking the parking lot, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across rows of cars, ordinary, predictable, steady, much like the life everyone assumed he lived, and he typed a short message, simple, respectful, without flourish, then slipped the phone back into his pocket. No smile, no visible anticipation, just that same grounded stillness. While upstairs, Claire listened to another report but heard none of it clearly, because her mind had already stepped outside the meeting, replaying his voice, that single word, yes, not defensive, not hopeful, just certain. And certainty without status had always unsettled her more than arrogance ever could. And she closed the folder in front of her a little too firmly, drawing a brief glance from the others. "We will continue this tomorrow," she said, rising before anyone could question the decision. And as the chairs shifted and the room began to empty, no one mentioned Daniel again out loud, but the assumption remained, quietly shared, quietly accepted, that whatever he believed he had, it could not possibly match the world they understood, and that belief, comfortable and unchallenged, was exactly what made the truth waiting just ahead so impossible to ignore. Daniel Brooks did not return to the conference room after that, and the building continued its day as if nothing had shifted, but something in him remained slightly separated from the rhythm of the place, as if he had stepped half a pace outside of a world that no longer required his explanation. And in the quiet corridor near the service elevators he stood for a moment longer than necessary, not because he was lost, but because he was aware, deeply aware, of how quickly people decide who someone is without ever asking them to become anything more. And then he moved again, steady, unhurried, carrying a small stack of documents that felt heavier than paper should, not from weight, but from responsibility. And as he reached the ground floor lobby, the sound of voices and footsteps returned around him like a tide that never paused for reflection, and he adjusted the strap of his worn work bag with a calm precision that had become second nature over the years, the kind of precision learned not in boardrooms, but in early mornings when there is no room for delay, because someone small is waiting at home for breakfast. And reassurance and that thought alone softened something in his expression, not into sadness but into purpose. And across the city block, traffic moved in steady streams, horns distant, pedestrians absorbed in their own trajectories, none of them aware that within the glass tower behind him, a small assumption had been born and left unattended. While Daniel crossed the street toward a modest cafe where he often stopped before heading to pick up his child, and inside, the warmth of coffee and quiet conversation wrapped around him like a familiar routine, and he ordered simply, nothing elaborate, nothing memorable, just enough to carry him through the next stretch of the day. And while he waited, he checked a school notification on his phone, a reminder about an upcoming parent meeting, and he read it twice, not because he had forgotten, but because repetition was how he kept everything aligned in a life where there was no one else to catch what might slip. And for a brief moment, his gaze drifted toward the window where reflections overlapped the street outside, his own image faint among moving figures, and there was something almost invisible about him in that moment, not because he lacked presence but because he never demanded it, and that invisibility had been mistaken more than once for insignificance, though those who made that mistake rarely stayed long enough to correct it. And upstairs in the glass-walled office, Claire Whitmore stood by her desk with her arms crossed, staring at a financial projection she had already reviewed, but her focus was elsewhere, not on numbers, but on patterns she could not quite categorize, because men like Daniel did not fit neatly into the framework she trusted, and that discomfort lingered in her mind longer than she expected, not enough to change her judgment, but enough to make it slightly unstable, like a line drawn in pencil instead of ink. And she disliked that feeling more than she admitted, so she buried it beneath another call, another decision, another reminder that in her world clarity was control and control was everything. Yet even as she moved through the rest of her afternoon, a small unresolved echo remained, subtle and persistent, the image of a man who did not defend himself because he did not need to, and in that absence of reaction, something unfamiliar had begun to form, not understanding, not yet, but the earliest shape of doubt, quiet and uninvited, waiting for a reason to grow. By the time evening settled over the city, Daniel Brooks had already shifted into the part of his day that no one in the glass tower ever saw, the part that required no audience and offered no recognition, and he walked 3 blocks from the cafe to a small grocery store where the lights were warm but plain, the kind of place that did not care who you were as long as you knew what you needed, and he moved through the aisles with quiet efficiency, selecting items with the practiced memory of someone who had repeated this routine more times than he could count: milk, bread, fruit, simple ingredients that would become dinner not because it was special, but because it was necessary. And as he stood in line, He received a short voice message from his child, soft and slightly rushed, asking if he would be home before dark, and Daniel listened twice before replying with calm reassurance, his voice steady, measured, the kind of calm that never needed exaggeration to feel real, and when he finished, he placed the phone back into his pocket and looked down at the small basket in his hand, as if grounding himself in the physical proof of responsibility, and around him, other customers spoke about weekend plans, restaurant reservations, small complaints about traffic, ordinary fragments of lives that moved without interruption, while Daniel's world was built on continuity, on showing up regardless of how the day had treated him. And later, as he stepped outside with a paper bag in hand, the sky had shifted into a deeper shade of blue, the kind that signals transition rather than ending, and he paused for a moment on the sidewalk, not because he was uncertain, but because he had learned to appreciate the silence between tasks, those brief pauses where nothing was required of him except presence, and in that stillness, his thoughts drifted not to the office, not to judgment or laughter or the faint echo of assumptions left behind in glass rooms, but to the small apartment waiting across town, where a drawing was probably taped to the refrigerator, where shoes might already be scattered near the door, where life was imperfect but honest, and that honesty mattered more to him than any opinion formed above him in meetings he would never need to attend again today. And at the same time, in a high-rise apartment across the city, Claire Whitmore stood in front of her floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the skyline, holding a glass of water she had not yet taken a sip from, her reflection layered over the city lights beginning to flicker on, and she replayed fragments of the day without intention, not out of curiosity, but because her mind refused to release them completely, the simplicity of his answer, the lack of defense, the absence of performance, and she found herself questioning not his words, but the ease with which she and others had filled in the gaps around him, as if silence must always equal lack, and she disliked how unfamiliar that question felt inside her structured certainty, so she turned away from the window and returned to her desk, activating her tablet, reviewing tomorrow's agenda, reinforcing order where uncertainty had briefly appeared. Yet even as she organized her schedule with precision, there remained a faint trace of unresolved thought at the edge of her focus, like a shadow that did not belong to any object in the room, and somewhere far below that skyline, Daniel continued his walk home with steady steps, unaware that the distance between how he lived and how he was perceived had already begun to narrow in ways neither side yet understood. The following morning arrived with a soft gray light spreading across the city, and Daniel Brooks was already awake long before most of the neighborhood stirred, moving through his small apartment with the quiet rhythm of someone who had learned to live efficiently without noise or distraction, and in the kitchen he prepared breakfast for his child with simple focus, measuring time not by clocks but by routines that could not afford disruption, and while toast browned and a kettle warmed he checked a school reminder pinned to the refrigerator, adjusting his schedule mentally without complaint, because flexibility was not a luxury in his life, it was a necessity, and when his child finally entered the kitchen, still half awake, Daniel offered a calm smile that required no words to feel steady, and they spoke briefly about the day ahead, about school activities and small plans that carried more importance than they might seem to anyone outside their world. And in those moments, there was no room for judgment or assumptions, only presence shared and real, and after breakfast he walked his child to the door, gently adjusting a backpack strap, pausing for a second as if to ensure everything was in place not just physically but emotionally, before watching them head out into the morning light. And when the door closed, the apartment fell into a familiar stillness that Daniel did not rush to fill, because silence, for him, was not emptiness but structure. And later that morning he returned to work, entering the same glass building as before, though now with a different weight in the air, not visible, not spoken, but subtly present in the way people glanced a second longer than necessary, in the way conversation softened when he passed, as if fragments of yesterday's assumption had not fully settled. And Claire Whitmore arrived shortly after, stepping out of a black car with the same composed precision she carried into every environment, her presence immediately reorganizing attention around her, and she moved through the lobby without hesitation, greeting colleagues with brief acknowledgement, yet her mind, unlike her posture, was not entirely aligned, because something from the previous day still lingered at the edges of her focus, not enough to disrupt her authority, but enough to make certain thoughts return uninvited. And when she entered the conference floor, she noticed Daniel already seated at a long table reviewing documents, calm as before, unchanged by the subtle shift in atmosphere. and for a brief moment their eyes met across the room, not as confrontation, not as agreement, but as recognition of something unresolved, though. Neither of them named it, and Claire took her seat at the head of the table, organizing the meeting with her usual efficiency, yet there was a slight delay in her usual certainty, a fraction of hesitation that no one else would notice, and as reports began and voices filled the room again, Daniel remained as he always had, attentive but unreactive, present but not performative, and in that contrast between perception and reality, between what was assumed and what simply existed, the room carried a quiet tension that no agenda item could fully contain, as if something beneath the surface was still waiting for its moment to be understood. The glass conference room felt different that afternoon, not because anything had changed on the surface, but because people inside it had begun to notice the weight of what they could not easily explain, and Daniel Brooks sat in his usual place along the long table, reviewing notes with the same quiet precision as always, while across from him Claire Whitmore led the discussion with controlled authority. Yet there was a subtle shift in how she paused between sentences, as if part of her attention was no longer fully anchored to the agenda, and the meeting moved forward with projections, deadlines, and performance summaries, but beneath the professional rhythm there was an unspoken undercurrent, something small but persistent, like a question no one had agreed to ask out loud, and when a junior manager mentioned upcoming client events, the conversation briefly touched on personal schedules, weekend availability, and informal networking plans, and it was then that Claire's gaze flicked toward Daniel for just a moment longer than necessary, because the memory of his calm answer days earlier had not fully faded, and it resurfaced now without invitation, not as curiosity exactly, but as comparison, as if her mind was testing the boundaries of what she believed she understood about people like him, and Daniel, unaware of her internal conflict, simply made a note on his document, his posture unchanged, his presence steady in a way that did not seek attention yet naturally held space. And when the meeting ended, chairs shifted, papers gathered, and conversations broke into smaller clusters, Claire remained seated for a moment longer than usual, watching the room dissolve back into motion while Daniel stood, collected his materials, and prepared to leave without hesitation. And it was in that brief overlap of movement that an announcement came through the office system, notifying select staff of a last-minute executive reception scheduled for the following evening, an event meant for high-level partners and leadership guests. And as names were projected onto the internal display, Claire's expression tightened slightly when she saw Daniel's name included in the list, not because it was inappropriate, but because it did not align neatly with the mental category she had unconsciously assigned him, and for the first time, a faint disruption formed in her certainty, not yet doubt, but something close to recalibration, while around them colleagues reacted with mild surprise, exchanging glances that carried unspoken interpretations, and Daniel himself simply read the notice, nodded once to acknowledge it, and continued walking, as if his presence on that list required no additional meaning. Yet behind him the atmosphere in the room subtly changed again, because inclusion has a way of rewriting assumptions without asking permission, and Claire found herself observing him more carefully as he left, not with judgment this time, but with a quiet reconsideration she did not fully understand, and the idea that had once seemed simple was no longer staying in its original shape, as something beneath it continued to shift slowly, steadily, toward a truth still waiting to be seen clearly. The executive reception began in a space designed to make silence feel expensive, a wide-open hall on the upper floor of the building where city lights pressed against glass walls like distant witnesses, and staff members moved with careful composure as if every step might be recorded in memory, while Daniel Brooks stood near the edge of the room holding a simple glass of water he had barely touched, observing without intrusion, the way he always did, present but unassuming. And across the room Claire Whitmore greeted arriving guests with practiced ease, her voice steady, her smile controlled, yet her attention kept returning to the entrance as more people filed in, because something about the list she had seen earlier had stayed with her longer than expected, and when Daniel's name appeared again in her mind, it no longer fit as neatly into the category she had once assigned it, and that subtle discomfort remained beneath her composure like a thread pulled slightly loose. And then the atmosphere shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that every person in the room seemed to register at the same time, as the main entrance doors opened with quiet precision and a new arrival stepped inside, and conversations softened almost instantly, not out of instruction but recognition, because the woman who entered did not carry herself like a guest trying to belong, but like someone for whom belonging was already assumed wherever she stood, and she moved forward with calm authority, her presence drawing attention without effort. And for a moment even Claire's expression paused in mid-conversation as she tried to place her face, not from uncertainty but from recalibration, and beside the entrance a staff member lowered their voice to a whisper, offering a name that traveled through nearby clusters like a current, and slowly the recognition settled, not as rumor but as fact, a senior executive investor connected to multiple divisions of the company's international board, someone whose approval influenced decisions far beyond this room. And as she continued walking deeper into the hall, her gaze shifted with quiet intention, scanning faces not in search of attention but in confirmation of presence until it landed on Daniel Brooks, and the moment that followed did not announce itself with sound, but with stillness, because her expression changed in a way that was subtle yet unmistakable, a soft acknowledgement that carried more weight than any introduction, and Daniel, noticing her approach, did not react with surprise or urgency, only a slight adjustment of posture, as if recognizing someone he had already expected to see, and when she stopped a few feet away from him, the surrounding conversations faded further, not completely gone but suspended, and she spoke his name with simple familiarity, the kind that does not require explanation, and in that instant Claire Whitmore, standing several steps away, felt something shift internally that she could not immediately categorize, because the relationship between the two did not match any assumption she had built around Daniel's place in this environment, and as brief greetings were exchanged, respectful, composed, understated, the room seemed to realign itself around an unspoken fact, that the man who had been quietly observed, lightly judged, and easily underestimated by many in the room was not positioned where they thought he was, and Claire watched without interrupting, her certainty from earlier meetings now encountering something it had not accounted for, and for the first time, the silence in the room did not feel like absence, but like recognition arriving late, settling in slowly as the shape of understanding began to change without asking permission. The room did not recover its previous rhythm after her words, because some sentences do not function as conversation but as revelation, and when Daniel Brooks and the senior executive investor finished their brief exchange, it left behind a silence that felt structured rather than empty, as if the space itself had adjusted to a new understanding that had not yet been verbally acknowledged, and Claire Whitmore remained where she stood, her glass still untouched, her attention fixed on the interaction she had just witnessed, not because it was loud or dramatic, but because it contradicted something she had considered stable, and for the first time that evening her certainty about Daniel did not feel complete, only constructed, and now that construction had begun to show seams, and across the room Daniel remained composed, his posture unchanged, his demeanor consistent with every previous moment she had observed, yet now reframed by context she had not previously possessed, and the executive investor spoke with him briefly, calmly, exchanging a few measured words that carried no performance, only familiarity and professional ease, before continuing deeper into the room, leaving Daniel once again in a quieter space near the edge of the gathering, and Claire found herself observing him more carefully than before, not with the passive curiosity of earlier meetings, but with active reassessment, as if she was now trying to reconcile two versions of the same person that no longer aligned, and the discomfort that had begun earlier in the day returned more strongly, not emotional, not reactive but analytical, because in her world inconsistency was something that demanded resolution, and yet Daniel remained unchanged in appearance, unchanged in expression, which made the inconsistency feel internal rather than external, and as guests continued to circulate, conversations resumed, and the event carried forward, Claire finally moved from her position, walking slowly toward the side of the hall where Daniel stood, not with urgency, but with deliberate control, and when she reached a respectful distance she paused as if recalibrating the tone of everything she thought she knew, and Daniel turned slightly toward her, acknowledging her presence without tension, and for a brief moment neither of them spoke, not out of avoidance but because the space between them felt different now, and Claire finally broke the silence with a calm, measured question that carried none of her earlier certainty, and Daniel answered in the same steady manner he always had, neither defensive nor evasive, simply direct, and as their exchange continued, short, restrained, but meaningful in its clarity, Claire began to understand that what she had interpreted as lack of significance had never been absence of importance, only absence of visibility from her perspective, and that realization did not arrive with drama, but with quiet precision, like something falling into place after being misaligned for a long time. And around them the reception continued as usual, but for Claire the room no longer felt uniform, because attention once given cannot easily return to ignorance, and what she now saw could not be unseen, and in that silent recognition, the balance of certainty she had carried since the beginning of the week shifted once more, this time not slightly but fundamentally, as the truth of Daniel Brooks began to emerge not through declaration, but through undeniable context that no assumption could fully contain. The final moments of the evening did not feel like closure, but like a quiet realignment of something that had been misread for a long time, and as the reception gradually softened into its closing rhythm, guests beginning to depart in small groups and conversations thinning into polite farewells, Daniel Brooks remained composed near the edge of the hall, speaking briefly with the senior executive investor who had arrived earlier, their exchange now calm and natural, as if it had always belonged in this environment rather than disrupting it, and Claire Whitmore stood several steps away, no longer surrounded by certainty, but by questions she had not expected to carry, because what she had witnessed was not dramatic revelation, but structural correction, and she could no longer return to the simplicity of her earlier assumptions, and when Daniel finally turned slightly toward her again, there was no performance in his expression, no need for validation, only steady presence, and that absence of need for approval unsettled her more than any confrontation could have, because it placed him outside the framework she had used to define people for years, and she realized that her earlier interpretation of him had been shaped not by his reality, but by the limits of her own perspective, and that realization did not feel like defeat, but like recalibration, uncomfortable but undeniable, and as the room slowly emptied, leaving behind the faint echoes of formal conversation and the soft movement of staff preparing to close the space, Claire finally spoke again, her voice lower now, without the confidence that had once defined it so clearly, and Daniel responded in the same measured tone he had used throughout every encounter, not offering more than necessary, not withholding anything essential, simply existing in clarity that required no defense, and in that exchange there was no reversal, no dramatic resolution, only understanding forming in real time, quiet and precise. And when the senior executive investor gave a final nod before leaving, acknowledging Daniel once more with respect that no longer required explanation, Claire observed the moment without interruption, and something within her settled into recognition that could not be reversed, because truth, once seen clearly, does not depend on agreement to remain true, and as Daniel prepared to leave the hall, walking with the same steady rhythm he had carried through every part of the day, there was no triumph in his movement, no desire to be seen differently, only continuation, and Claire remained behind for a few seconds longer, looking at the space he had just occupied, understanding now that dignity had never been absent from him, only overlooked, and in the silence that followed, the room felt no longer like a place of judgment, but like a place where perception itself had finally been corrected. A single father, Daniel Brooks, quietly carries dignity through a world that misjudges him at every turn, while a powerful female CEO, Claire Whitmore, learns that certainty can hide deeper truth. Their collision of perspective unfolds through quiet office tension, emotional distance, and unexpected recognition that reshapes everything they believed about status and worth. What begins as misunderstanding evolves into reflection, where silence speaks louder than judgment, and every assumption slowly dissolves under reality. Touching stories emerge from moments of restraint, where no one raises their voice yet everything changes in meaning, revealing how perception can fail even the most intelligent minds. As the executive world shifts around them, touching stories continue to surface through subtle gestures, unseen connections, and quiet respect that grows in unexpected places, reminding us that touching stories are not built on spectacle but on truth revealed slowly, and touching stories leave behind lessons that cannot be ignored, especially when touching stories challenge pride and reshape understanding between people who were never as far apart as they seemed. If you enjoyed this, subscribe. More stories are coming.